See, I don't think we need it here for Connecticut.
As long as we understand white nationalism as a particular form of 21st century fascism, a particular way that fascism appears in the hues and colors of our generation. Right?
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. And welcome back, people in the Danbury, Connecticut area. We've been off for several months, but we have a new sponsor, and we're now showing in your area again. We start with a terrifying prediction just made yesterday by a prominent economist, Monica DeBole. She said that soaring deforestation rates of the Amazon rainforest could push it over tipping points in just 2 years, after which it would become a much drier land, a savanna, and that would result with the release of billions of tons of carbon into the air. The article in The Guardian says a Brazilian economist, Carlos Nobre, thinks the tipping point really is in 20 years. But, he says, if she's right, it is the end of the world. Now, my question to Ned Lamont, the governor of Connecticut. I asked him last weekend at an event in New Haven whether he would stop the proposed Killingly fracked gas power plant, which itself would send 2 million tons of carbon dioxide into the air each year.
Look, that's a regional plant, but I'm taking a good hard look at it. See, I don't think we need it here for Connecticut. We've got a 2040. We're saying we're going to be off, we're going to have a carbon-free grid by 2040. I'm going to be meeting with my fellow governors in the next few days. That's Rhode Island. That's Massachusetts. See whether they make the same commitment. Then we'll see whether we need this Killingly plant at all.
The effort to convince him goes on. One vehicle is with memes. PEP, Promoting Enduring Peace, has extended its meme contest to next Wednesday, October 30th. See pepeace.org for details. Speaking of graphics, this one is terrific and terrible. It shows some of the results of the ongoing Saudi-U.S. war against Yemen. I won't show you pictures of starving Yemeni children. Just this terrible fact: 20 million people facing hunger in Yemen. Last week we reported on the beating of an 80-year-old rabbi by a right-wing Jewish mob. We regretfully misidentified him as Moshe Yehuda Borin. Actually, he's Rabbi Moshe Yehuda. He was attacked in the Palestinian town of Berin. He was assaulted with an iron bar by some Israeli from a segregated Jewish-only town called Yitzhar. We now have some photos and some video of the destruction by arson of olive trees in that area. For more about this, see the newest column by Rabbi Arik Asherman in peacenews.org. On Saturday, November 2nd, the Middle East Crisis Committee will be holding a meeting in New Haven, and I'll be talking about my new book, Zionist Betrayal of Jews. It's an account of the many, many times that Zionist groups and the Israeli government have put their interests ahead of that of millions of Jews in countries all over the world. The meeting, which is free and open to all, will take place at the New Haven Library, 133 Elm Street in New Haven, right across from the Green. The meeting is co-sponsored by Jewish Voice for Peace, New Haven. We recorded the talks at the anti-fascism event held in New Haven, sponsored by the Counterpoint radio program. Here is the first talk by Christopher Viles. He's introduced by Scott Harris of Counterpoint.
I'm very proud to and pleased to introduce our first speaker, Professor Chris Viles, who's an American professor of English at the University of Connecticut Stores, where he's also Director of American Studies. Professor Viles has appeared on PBS, NPR, and CBC Radio, and others, to discuss fascism in the United States. Please welcome Professor Chris Viles.
So thank you so much for coming out. Can you hear me okay? So thank you so much for coming out, and also thank you so much to Scott for having me out. It's an honor to be here and be honored to be a part of this panel. But today I'm not going to so much talk about whether or not fascism is possible in America and the United States. I'm going to more instead talk about how it's already appeared in the United States, right? And also how it's shaped our institutions across the 20th century. And to that end, what I was going to kind of conclude on is how this thing we're calling white nationalism, which I'm calling a kind of a fascism of the 21st century, how it differs from its earlier manifestations, right? What's new about kind of white nationalism. Just first a quick anecdote. I used to teach in Germany, and I went back to Germany for the first time in over a decade in 2017. And I could say, like, historians in Germany and also, ordinary people in Germany are very reticent about Americans using the F word to describe anything outside in their own country for the most part. But what was striking to me was how even at this conference I'd gone to that brought together historians of fascism and anti-fascism across Europe and North America, how reticent German historians were to using that term fascism to describe Trump, and were so willing to say, like, you Americans have a problem. It's because their own Nazis, their own literal neo-Nazis, are Sieg-heiling Trump, right? As are the far right across Europe. But a few things on definition. When we say there's a kind of a term floating around, white nationalism, in the media, and I'm okay with that term. I think it works as long as we understand white nationalism as a particular form of 21st century fascism, a particular way that fascism appears in the hues and colors of our generation, right? And in terms of, just to also get this out there, kind of a working definition of fascism I'm operating off of, and I will say from the outset that there's no consensual definition of fascism, like no two people are going to define that alike. I'm fine, but I'm just saying this is my working definition. I see fascism as a particular strand of right-wing politics, and it's distinct from conservatism in the sense that it's based around militarism, a cult of the warrior, a hyper-masculine fetish of action, anti-Marxism, and a violent racist drive for national renewal. And it's also got, and this is where it's separated from conservatism in my view, it's got a populist element in the sense that unlike classical conservatism or right-wing dictatorships like that you often see in Latin America, it's not driven by traditional elites who are wishing to simply preserve their economic power, right? It's more driven by middle-class activists who are animated by this symbol-heavy mythic drive for national renewal, right? So that's a key difference I see, is that it's not just, it's as a form of right-wing politics, it's not just about elites preserving the power power. It's more specific. It comes from the middle tiers, typically. Now, when people talk about fascism in America, which is kind of my, specialty of late, it's important to distinguish between three things. There's one, a fascist kind of mindset or fascist political rhetoric. That's one. Also fascist movements and a fascist state, right? So as terms of a fascist state, there's only been mercifully few fascist states in the world, right? Germany and Italy are the ones that everybody agrees on. Others will, throw in, like myself, Franco's Spain or Imperial Japan, right? But mercifully few fascist states. The United States, even under Trump, I would say, is not a fascist state. But there have been fascist movements virtually everywhere since really the 1920s, but particularly from the 1930s on. And fascist movement, this is a premise of my last book, fascist movements can do a hell of a lot of damage even when they don't take state power. And they have done a hell of a lot of damage in US history, over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st, right? And there's a quote that I always kind of go back to from a historian at Oxford, Roger Griffin, who wrote in 1993, he said, as a political ideology capable of spawning new movements, fascism should be treated a permanent feature of modern culture, right? Fascism, in other words, never really died if we look at it in terms of movements, not states, right? And so, and one of the things that, in terms of historical fascist movements in the US, and I'm not talking about so much I'm not focusing in my own stuff on what the Southern Poverty Law Center calls hate groups. There's always been a galaxy of fringe organizations, like the Traditionalist Workers' Party, and certain variants of the Klan. And these aren't to be laughed off, right? They murder people, they terrorize people, they kill people. In fact, like right-wing terror groups have killed far more people than quote-unquote Islamic extremists over the 21st century, right? So they're not to be laughed off, but what I'm kind of focused on more are these fascist or fascist-esque movements that have gotten so large that they've actually impacted mainstream political institutions, and that's already happened at least 4 times in the 20th century, right? The first time, I'd say I'm not going to go into these in detail now for time's sake, but the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, right, which was kind of openly looking to Mussolini in certain ways, although they hated Italians, so they wouldn't go there too far. That's a kind of a problem with these right-wing coalitions sometimes. But they were a mass movement, as is well known. They had people in the U.S. Senate. But what's less known is their lobbying actually shaped the immigration laws that we have today. They were kind of instrumental behind the passage of the Quota Act of 1921, the Johnson Reid Act of 1924, which basically set quotas on immigration to the United States for the first time, and in doing so created the category of the illegal alien, right? We can go into that more in Q&A, but it's an example of a fascist movement that actually impacted the structure of America. Also in the 30s, we had Father Coughlin and the quote-unquote Christian Front. Father Coughlin who's a radio priest operating out of the suburbs of Detroit. He had a radio audience in the millions, basically, and also had a kind of a street organization, the Christian Front. But he was America's first right-wing radio guy, openly anti-Semitic, was fond of saying that Nazism is simply a defense mechanism against communism, right? These kind of things, blame Jews for the Holocaust. But as such, his lobbying and the efforts of his million-strong kind of lobbying organization also kind of ensured that the United States did not enter the Spanish Civil War with fatal consequences for Europe and global history. We also had in the United States elements of kind of the anti-civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, but most famously, and a lot of people probably here remember George Wallace, right? Students, you have to train them who George Wallace was. He was kind of the first, the kind of A lot of pundits, I think, have said rightly that he was the closest thing to a Trump we had before Trump, would say wild things at his rallies when he ran in 1968 and 1972 under an independent party platform, and would have actually Klansmen show up at his rally, Nazis in actual uniforms at his rallies. But in any case, Wallace, in the kind of spawned the quote-unquote Southern strategy, or the, what's now called dog whistle politics, the subtle appeal to kind of white racial resentment. Even though he went down in flames, that said, he shaped the contours of the Republican Party. And at the time, in the late 60s, everyone from the Black Panthers to William F. Buckley were saying that that guy is American fascism, right? And they were right. Now, finally, I would say, the elements of the Christian right have also kind of fit, into that definition, particularly the Christian Reconstructionists. A guy named R.J. Rushdoony, if you've ever heard of this guy, he was very foundational to what we're calling kind of right-wing evangelicism. And he was pioneer of the homeschool movement. It would appear on the 700 Club repeatedly. He wrote a book called The Institutes of Biblical Law that we published in 1973 that was really, if you look at this, it's the closest thing to an American Mein Kampf I've ever read. It basically advocates for a theocracy to be established in the United States that would put homosexuals to death, that would, basically look like Margaret Atwood's Gilead, and in doing so would usher in the rapture, right? And this has been foundational in that movement, at least his kind of strand of politics. But in any case, so going forward, the tendencies, so every fascism, every kind of national context, its fascist movements take on fairly specific national characteristics in addition to having the generic characteristics. So in the United States, American fascism has tended to have several tendencies that differentiate it from Europe. One of those I see is that it tends to be without a political party. Right? In the United States, we have a two-party system, Democrats, Republicans. In Europe, where you have a 5 or 6-party system, where strands of the left and right can kind of separate into their different kind of components and units, it's a little bit easier to see who the fascists are. Like the NDP in Germany, who were around for a while ago, they could say they're not fascists, but enough ex-SS guys start showing up at your meeting, you're not really fooling anyone, right? But if we had in the United States a 5-party system and one of them was called the American Freedom and Homeland Party or something like this, we might go, okay, it's those guys, right? So it tends to be a little bit more disguised because it can't really cohere in a two-party system, right? But also, American fascism tends to have a Christian bent. If anything, the historical fascist movements, the largest, tended to be a bit more pagan, right? Except for Spain, that's a big except. But even the Phalangists were, fairly secular. But American fascist movements and currents, the influential ones, tend to be fairly Christian. There's also in the United States this kind of strange embrace of fascist, a strange and contradictory embrace of constitutional principles. So where Hitler and Mussolini were kind of famously and explicitly anti-democracy, in the United States, if you see from even the American Nazi Party will say, we embrace the Constitution of the United States, which makes no sense if you're authoritarian, but we can hopefully parse that out in Q&A if you want to. And finally, the tendencies of American fascist currents, after 1941 at least, they tend to disavow the term fascism. And that's not unique to the United States. There's a lot of fascist currents in Europe who do the same thing. But you will more typically, I think, see a little bit more of a kind of a tendency to embrace that or kind of flirt with that term in these fascist currents in Europe. Now, what's new about then white nationalism in the United States, right? When we say white nationalism, how is this distinct? And by the way, I'm not playing with my phone, I'm just checking the time and it keeps kind of going off. But so when we say white nationalists in the United States, as you probably, I don't need you to tell you this, but we're not talking about a formal movement, an organized kind of crystallized network movement that's cohering behind a political party. We're talking about a number of kind of strands that are networked and overlapped. I tend to see when we're talking about the fascist currents now under white nationalism, I tend to see this as 3 main groups. One is the kind of the hardcore Trump supporters that are kind of they're prototypical kind of newspaper or the website is Breitbart. I don't know if you ever looked at that, but that is for me, and this tends to be kind of an older strand of this white nationalist kind of network. The second I would see is the Christian right that's still around. They never really went in anywhere. That movement, I think, went into crisis after George W. Bush, but they're still around. But the third and the most kind of dynamic is the quote-unquote alt-right, the identitarians. That I see, those are younger folks, and I see that as kind of the vanguard of fascism and white nationalism in the United States, and the direction it will probably take in the future, right? And a few things about this that's unique to the alt-right, this kind of more dynamic strand of white nationalism now, is they tend to use, and this is unlike, like how does the alt-right, in other words, differ from these other fascist currents? What's new about them? They tend to use the language of multiculturalism because they have to. It's the political terrain in which they operate, in the sense that what you'll see amongst the quote-unquote identitarians, which is, across the alt-right, they'll say consistently at their more polite moments, they'll say, well, black people get to celebrate, their heritage, Asian people get to celebrate their heritage, Latinos get to celebrate their heritage. We're just celebrating white heritage. We're just celebrating our own identity and our own culture and our own kind of European heritage and identity. So, but of course, this is, not only is that, very deeply problematic, but the most obvious way is it's clearly in bad faith, because some of them, the biggest identitarian group in the United States, Identity Europa, also on their website would, circulate tracts on biological racism, talking about the genetic superiority of whites, and, which is no surprise, right? So they tend to use the language of multiculturalism. We also had a speaker at UConn where I teach, Lucian Wendridge, a couple of years ago, who did a speech called "It's Okay to Be White." I was kind of proud to say that we all kind of ran him out of town on rail. He literally had to hightail it out of there, right? So this is not, hegemonic, of course, yet. But also what's new about the alt-right is also expresses itself ironically and in using satirical terms, right? So you've probably seen the symbol Pepe the Frog, the kind of the gross little kind of frog that they use as kind of their mascot. If I had a PowerPoint, I'd show it up there. But it's unimaginable that Hitler or Mussolini would have used a kind of a cartoon figure, or in there they would have engaged in things that are akin to the meme wars, but it's unbelievable that they would use this kind of ironic figure, or things like Kekistan, these other kind of ironic expressions of white nationalist or identitarian ideology. So that's a new feature of them that's kind of different from their predecessors. Also, unlike American fascisms of the past, the alt-right tends to be more secular. They do tend to be, they kind of break with that American tradition of having a more Christian-oriented fascism. Their anti-feminism is sharper than earlier fascist incarnations in the United States or in Europe. I would say that just simply also because, feminism since the late 1960s has been much more visible, right? And so it's much more of a target for them. And finally, what's new about this more kind of latest incarnation of fascism, and this extends even to Breitbart, is that they're more in dialogue with Europe than earlier incarnations of fascism. So whether you're talking about George Wallace or the Klan or Father Coughlin, yeah, sure, they had some European ties, but the contemporary alt-right is seamlessly in dialogue with Europe, right? And that means that they are also more explicitly playing with fascism and more explicitly identifying with it too, right? And so that we're dealing with a more, we're on the cusp of a mainstreaming of even the word fascism and bringing that back into play as a legitimate category in US politics, right? So kind of wrapping up here, well, and finally, their proximity to power, right? In the book, I kind of made because I came out with the last book on 2014 during the Obama years, and I kind of made this I can't imagine there'd ever be a president who would actually be fascist. We're just talking about the United States, we're talking about movements that are going to do damage, and I still hold to that thesis. But with Trump, where I kind of see him in going back to that distinction between fascist states, fascist mindsets, fascist movements, he has fascist rhetoric, and he has a fascist mind and a temperament. And he mobilizes actual fascist. He doesn't command a literal fascist party, and he's yet to turn the United States into a fascist state, a full-blown fascist state. Be that as it may, that's not to say I think we should relax, obviously. We've seen through Donald Trump that fascist words can, win an election, right? Trump doesn't really, I can't imagine the military kind of rallying behind this guy as a coup. But at the same time, with Trump, you've got somebody who's proven to us that not only can fascist words win an election, but that and that fascism is electorally viable. But what I worry about is a future figure, maybe somebody who's more disciplined, who doesn't shoot themselves in the foot every 5 seconds, who's maybe has a military background and is read as a man of honor, right? These kind of things that are more something along the lines that scare me more than, so I think we need to start thinking about white nationalism after Trump, right? And finally, but I'll just say end on a happy note though too, maybe not happy, but end on a note. The United States has equally strong, if not stronger, anti-fascist traditions that have checked these mobilizations time and time and time again, right? And there was when I was in the archives looking at an organization called the American League Against War and Fascism, they had the minutes and the notes from one of their meetings and then one of their speeches from 1938. And there was a speaker at this gathering of the American League of War Against War and Fascism in 1938 who said something that really stuck with me. He said, America is not going to go fascist just because Americans have it in just written into their souls or into their national character that we're, some kind of a freedom-loving people. No, America is only, whether or not America goes fascist depends on who gets organized first. So with that, I'll leave you guys, and thanks so much.
We conclude with a few minutes of Democracy Now!'s recent reports on the massive demonstrations in Lebanon.
Mass protests in Lebanon have entered their 6th day as hundreds of thousands around the country are taking to the streets to demonstrate against dire economic conditions, austerity, and corruption, demanding the country's leaders step down. The protests sparked last week when the government announced a tax on WhatsApp calls. But the massive demonstrations have since grown into a call for revolution. More than 1 million demonstrators flooded the streets of Beirut, Tripoli, and other cities over the weekend. The government has revoked the WhatsApp tax, and on Monday, Prime Minister Saad Hariri announced a package of economic reforms. But protesters are continuing to call for his ouster.